Good afternoon, students. Today is Friday, 16 April 2021. We're starting a new topic today. Now, the main topic that we're about to undertake has to do with healthcare, and specifically whether there's a right to healthcare. Early in the course, in fact, the first article we read and discussed was by Sarah Conley. She took it for granted that there's a right to healthcare. In other words, she didn't argue that there is. And her goal in her essay was to try to describe certain limits to the right to health care. And so that led her to talk about our responsibilities as individuals to keep healthcare costs down. But there is an actual debate among philosophers and others about whether there is a right to healthcare, and if so, what it encompasses. So I thought it would be useful to read an essay by a philosopher, a prominent philosopher, who argues that there is no right to health care, that individuals have no right to make a claim on others to provide them with health care, and certainly no right to make a claim on government. In other words, to certain people, such as Jan Narveson, their individuals are responsible for their own health and therefore their own health maintenance. And you can't and shouldn't look to other people to pay for your health care. So we're about to start that essay by Jan Narveson. Since Narveson is a libertarian, I thought it would be useful to spend one day reading and discussing an article that sets out the libertarian position. And we're going to do that today. We may spend a little bit of the next lecture finishing this essay, and then we'll move on to Narveson from there. So the essay that we're discussing today, here's my copy of it. It's posted on Canvas for you to print. The essay appears in a book entitled The Libertarian Alternative. The book is edited by Tibor Machan. This book was published in 1974. The first chapter of this book, written by John Hospers, is entitled What Libertarianism Is. Now, Hospers is a longtime libertarian, as Narveson is, and Hospers has written many textbooks on various topics. He's a very good writer. He keeps your interest up, and I think as an instructor, I do care about things like that. I want to make sure that the things I assign are understandable to my students and keep their interest up. So today we're going to look at the general theory known as libertarianism. And when we get to the article by Narveson, which by the way is now posted on Canvas for you to print and read, when we get to the article by Narveson, you'll see that his argument against a right to health care comes directly from his political theory, which is libertarianism. So remember, my goal is not to indoctrinate you at any point in the course. I want you to know what libertarianism is. Some of you may be attracted to it and want to learn more about it. Others of you may be appalled by it and repulsed by it. You may think that it's the wrong approach to politics. And that's okay. You can have any of those attitudes you want. What I want you to do is to understand the theory and be able to answer questions about it on the examination, which, by the way, is on the 11th of May. I'm going to keep reminding you. I know you're tired of hearing it, but it's less than a month away. Make sure you watch my lectures as they are posted. Don't put off your viewing until just before the exam, because then if something comes up, you won't have time to watch all the hours of videos. All right, so let's get started. I posted my lecture notes for Hospers' essay on Canvas, and I hope you printed them and have them in front of you. You can sort of follow along as I go through my lecture. There is on the first page a bunch of biographical information about Hospers. I'll let you read that for yourself. He had a long life, a very full and busy and productive life. He was born 103 years ago, almost, in 1918 in what looks like a little town in Iowa. And he went from there to He went off to the city. He got his PhD degree in philosophy at Columbia University, one of the oldest and greatest universities, which is located in New York City. So a boy from Iowa, maybe a farm boy, went off to the big city, the biggest city in the country, and received a doctoral degree. He then began teaching at various places. Most of his career was spent at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. And he was their director of the School of Philosophy for many years. He died just 10 years ago in June of 2011 at the age of 93. You can see that he wrote a great many books. They're listed there on the lecture notes. Oh, by the way, Hospers was not just an egghead with his head in the clouds, if you will. Hospers actually ran for president of the United States. In 1972, when he was 54 years old, he ran for president on the Libertarian Party ticket, which makes sense. He was a libertarian in political philosophy, and that's the year a new political party was created, and it was called the Libertarian Party, and he was its first presidential candidate. He didn't win, as you may have expected, but he did receive some votes. You can see in my notes he received about 5,000 popular votes across the country, and guess what? He got one electoral vote. I think a wayward or rogue elector voted for him in the Electoral College, even though that person was bound to vote for some other candidate. So who were the other two candidates in 1972? Richard Nixon, who was running for re-election, and I believe his opponent that year was George McGovern from South Dakota. George McGovern with his running mate, Sargent Shriver. And of course, Nixon won re-election. Within 2 years, however, he resigned the presidency as a result of the so-called Watergate scandal. His vice president, Gerald Ford, took over as president. Ford ran for president 2 years later in 1976 and was defeated by Jimmy Carter, whom I'm sure you've heard of. Okay, so Hospers had a long, productive life. Let's get into the heart of his essay. I may not cover every detail. I'll try to cover the important points, and we'll see how long it takes. Hospers divides his essay up into two parts, and you can see that because there's a heading about halfway through. On page 12, at the very top, over here, I have it in yellow, it says government. So there's only one subdivision in the whole essay. So the way I view it is, excuse me, in the first half of the essay, Hospers discusses what he calls the libertarian thesis. And in the second half, he focuses in on government specifically and what the libertarian says and believes about government, about the proper role of government and so forth. So let's get started on the first half, and we're simply now going to try to understand what this libertarian thesis is. The word libertarian or libertarianism has within it the root liber, L-I-B-E-R, which in Latin means liberty or freedom. Hospers uses the root libertas. So the word comes from the Latin word for freedom or liberty. And that's characteristic of libertarians. They exalt the individual. They're down on groups and collectives. They're up on individuals like you and me. And they believe in individual liberty or freedom. Liberty primarily from government. We should be free of governmental interference in our lives. That's the libertarian credo or mantra. Here are different ways to state the libertarian thesis. And I'm reading these from pages 3, 3, and 5. The first one comes from page 3, the second one from page 3, the third one is a couple of pages later, it's page 5. And I'll try to give you my sense of what he means by these. On page 3, Hospers says, the libertarian thesis says that, quote, no one is anyone else's master and no one is anyone else's slave, unquote. Now, what does that mean? It means that in society, citizens are equals of one another. There are no hierarchies, no natural hierarchies where some people are at the top and they have a higher legal or political or moral status than people below them, who have a higher status than people below them, and so on. So there's no hierarchy. Everyone is equal morally, legally, and politically. No one's above the law or below the law. Everyone is subject to the same laws. Now, that may not be true in practice, but that's, in theory, that's what the libertarian endorses. And the libertarian would criticize any application of a law that was unequal. If certain people, members of a certain political party or a powerful family, were not held to account under the law, that would be wrong, according to a libertarian. And if some people were treated worse than others under the law, that would also be wrong. So think of that first statement of the thesis as ruling out hierarchies. It requires that individuals be treated equally, that they be equals in the eyes of the law. Secondly, on page 3 also, Hospers says the libertarian thesis can be stated as follows, quote, "Other men's lives are not yours to dispose of," unquote. You can think of that as the self-ownership principle. You own your life, I own mine. Each person owns and has rightful control over his or her own life. Right? Nobody owns anyone else. No one has a right to dispose of anyone else's life or property or any other aspect of that person. Okay, so self-ownership. Third, on page 5, Hospers says no human being should be a non-voluntary mortgage on the life of another. Now, you know what a mortgage is. When you buy a house, typically you can't pay for it in cash, so you borrow the money from what's called a mortgage company. The mortgage company agrees to pay for your house over time. The mortgage company pays for your house all at once, and you pay the mortgage company back little by little on a monthly basis. You pay a mortgage payment. And typically, in order to compensate the mortgage company for the use of its money, you have to pay interest. So the mortgage company lends out money to people who want to buy a home, and it charges them interest on the money that it has loaned. And in return, the mortgage company gets an interest, a legally protectable interest in the house or in the property. And so if you fail to pay your monthly payment, at some point the mortgage company can come in and take possession of your house and use the law to evict you from it. And the grounds would be you breached your contract. You were supposed to pay a mortgage payment every month, and you have not been doing so. So the mortgage company always has that as security. It can take the property if you fail to pay for it, as required by the contract. Now, why did Hospers use that term here? It's not clear, but I think what he's saying, and if you read the paragraph, it's clear what he's saying. Nobody's life or work belongs to anyone else. Nobody has a security interest in anyone else's life or property or liberty. So I think even though he used the word mortgage, maybe he should have found some other way to express it. That's the idea that he's trying to convey. Nobody's life or work or property belongs to anyone else. So you can see how that's related to the second formulation of self-ownership. Now, to a libertarian, there are negative rights and negative duties. And I'm going to explain that in a few minutes. In fact, maybe I should do it now. Otherwise, I'm going to be doing it anyway in a few minutes. I may as well pause now and explain the difference between a negative right and a positive right. And that will require explaining the difference between a negative duty and a positive duty. So let me begin with a negative right. If I have a negative right to something, such as my life, what that means is that I have a right to be left alone. I have a right to tell other people, leave me alone. Don't interfere with me unless I give you my consent. Okay? Leave me alone. Don't interfere with me. I'm entitled to do as I please without your interference. That's a negative right. Now, if I have a negative right, somebody, at least one other person, maybe everyone, has a duty. In this case, it would be a negative duty, and that duty would simply be the duty to leave me alone, the duty not to interfere with me. So you can see that for Hospers, a negative right correlates with a negative duty. Okay? Anytime somebody has a negative right, a right to be left alone, someone else has a right to leave that person alone. And often it's everybody else. So my negative right to life correlates with a duty on the part of everyone else in the world not to kill me, to leave me alone, and not to injure or kill me. Now, a positive right, which correlates with a positive duty, is quite different. A positive right is a right to have other people's assistance or help. A positive right would include a right to have something that someone else owns or possesses. So, for example, suppose I have a positive right to life. That means that I have a right that other people give me what I need to stay alive. And that could include medical equipment or medical care. It could require that people come to rescue me when my life is threatened. So a positive right goes much further than a negative right, doesn't it? A negative right just says, leave me alone. A positive right says, oh, and by the way, I have a right to come in and take stuff from you to protect my right or to protect my life. So if I have a positive right to something, at least one other person, and maybe everyone, has a positive duty to supply it to me, to give it to me, or to make it accessible or available to me. So that's the basic distinction between a negative right and a positive right. And each of them is correlated with the corresponding duty. Now, let me go back to where I started. I said that to a libertarian, the only rights there are negative rights. With one exception, I can enter into an arrangement with somebody to agree to help him or her. That person then would have a positive right against me, and I would have a positive duty. The positive duty exists because I agreed to it. So positive duties can come about through voluntary agreement. Only voluntary agreement. All right, so each of us has negative rights that we have simply by virtue of being human beings or persons. And some of us, in addition, have positive rights because others have agreed to give us certain things. So that's a matter of agreement. Okay? So libertarians emphasize negative rights. Those are the main rights to a libertarian. So here's how Hospers puts it, summarizing what he said so far on page 5. Each human being has the right to live his life as he chooses, compatibly with the equal right of all other human beings to live their lives as they choose. So we're all on the same level. We're all equals of one another. Each of us has the same right, namely to live our lives as we choose or as we please. And as you will see, there are limits on that right. I can't do just anything I want. My right to do as I please ends at the tip of your nose. That's the old saying. So I have a right to walk around swinging my arms or swinging a stick. Right? That's a right I have. I have a right to be left alone doing that. And no one can interfere with me morally. But if I hit you with that stick or with my arm, now I've harmed someone else. I've done something that affects another person adversely. At that point, I've exceeded the scope of my right. I've gone too far. And as you will see, libertarians believe that the government has a role at that point in stepping in and either punishing me because I have harmed you or allowing you to sue me in civil court for damages because I have, maybe I broke your nose with my stick and you had to go to the hospital and have your nose set. and that's going to cost a sum of money. And you then can sue me to recover the money, as well as a certain amount of money for what's called pain and suffering. The goal of a lawsuit like that is to make you whole again, to put you back in what's called the ex ante status, which means the status you were in before I hit you. So libertarians do believe in government. They do believe in laws, both civil and criminal, but they believe that the role of government is limited, right? And I'm about to tell you in the next few minutes what the limits are of government. Now, on this issue, you may have heard the term anarchist before. Libertarians are not anarchists. Anarchists believe that no government is legitimate. Not just no existing government, but no conceivable government. Anarchists, the word anarchy means an-archy. Archy means rule by. And when you put a or an in front of a word, it means not. So anarchy means rule by nobody. There are no rulers. There's no government. And because there's no government, there is no law. Individuals may do as they please. Now, some people think that a state of anarchy would be a nice place to be, a nice place to live. They think that people outside of government could get along and work together, cooperate, and live good lives. Other people think that a state of anarchy would be a bad place. Thomas Hobbes described the state of nature, which is a state without government, as a horrible place. He called it a war of all against all. Thomas Hobbes said in 1651 that a state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It would be a horrible place. People would happily create a government to rule over them in order to escape that horrible state of nature. Anyway, an anarchist is a proponent of no government, someone who believes that no government is legitimate. And I want you to realize that libertarians are not anarchists. Libertarians believe that some government is legitimate and justified, but they want it to be a small government, limited to certain basic functions. And we'll talk about those in a few minutes. So what are the basic rights that we have? The basic negative rights that each individual has, according to Hospers and other libertarians, they are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. It's interesting that the Declaration of Independence lists 3 natural rights, but they're different. 2 of them are the same and 1 of them is different. The Declaration of Independence, let's see whether I can recite it from memory, the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and, not property, but the pursuit of happiness. So if Hospers and other libertarians had their way, they would have written the Declaration of Independence differently. They would have slipped the word property in instead of pursuit of happiness. But for whatever reason, Thomas Jefferson and the other framers or drafters of the Declaration decided it's best to put the pursuit of happiness in there rather than property. All right, so just remember how the Declaration's wording differs from Hospers and other libertarians. Property looms pretty large to a libertarian. In fact, let's talk about that right now. On page 5, Hospers writes, "The right to property is as basic as the other 2. Indeed, without property rights, no other rights are possible." Think about that for a moment. Hospers is saying that not only that the right to property is just as important as the right to life and the right to liberty, but in some ways it's more important, right? He says, without property rights, no other rights are even possible. What does he mean by that? Well, look at page 7. He says there that the right to property, quote, is your assurance that what you have worked to earn will still be there and be yours when you wish or need to use it, especially when you're too old to work any longer. unquote. That's from page 7. So if your property can be taken from you by government without your consent or permission or authorization, then that makes you vulnerable, right? You can't plan for the future. And once your working days are over, when you become feeble and unable to work, you're going to be depending on the money that you saved up. That's your property. If government can come in and take it from you, then your existence is precarious indeed. Your very life may be at risk. If you cannot provide for yourself, you may become dependent on others. And if you have no others who are willing to help you or care for you, then you may end up dying for lack of property. So property gives us security against calamity, against uncertainty. It gives us security in our old age. So an argument could be made that of the three rights, life, liberty, and property, the third one, is more important than the others. At least that's what Hospers seems to be saying. So think of each individual as occupying his or her own sovereign domain. I often use the metaphor of a bubble. Think of each individual as existing in a bubble, and these bubbles are floating through space. According to the libertarian, I have a right, each of us has a right that other people stay out of our bubbles. Now, I may want someone to come into my bubble and either help me or do something for me, and that's fine, as long as it's voluntary. But you have no right to go into anyone else's bubble unless that person consents to it. So these bubbles are kind of floating around, and each of them represents an individual's domain. This is my space, my world, and you have to stay out of it and leave me alone unless and until I give you permission to do something, to harm me in some way or take something that I have. And we do this from time to time. People are quite generous. People are willing to give of themselves for the sake of others, including strangers. Right? So Hospers and other libertarians have no objection to charity, but everything must be done voluntarily. If you want to give away all of your wealth, that's up to you. Right? Other people might think you're being stupid and irresponsible, and they may try to reason with you and talk you out of it, but at the end of the process, it's your decision because it's your property. And you can do with it as you please. That's part of the concept of property. Okay? Once you acquire property, you can make use of it, you can modify it in any way, you can damage it if you so choose, you can destroy it, you can give it away as a gift, you can sell it, trade it, whatever. Right? That's all part of the concept of a property right. Right? It's your stuff, and you get to decide what happens to it. Now, what are the basic ways we influence other people? Well, we sometimes use force on other people, and I'm not saying it's legitimate. I'm just saying, what are the possible ways of getting your way? Force, physical force, threatening people with force, which may work. Right? I may not need to use force on you, because if I make a credible threat to use force on you, you may do what I want. For example, when a robber puts a gun to your head and says, your money or your life, the robber may not have to touch you at all, which means no physical force, but the robber is threatening you with force in the hope that you will understand the situation and value your life more than your property. The robber wants you to hand over your wallet or purse. That's called coercion. Coercion is where you get what you want from others by threatening them with harm if they don't comply. So, back to my list. These are ways to get what you want. Force, coercion, manipulation. You can appeal to people's emotions. You can get what you want by making people feel guilty. You can appeal to people's love for you. That's the basis for the old saying, if you love me, you would. Right? That means you want something from somebody, and you've decided the best way to get it is to exploit that person's love for you. You can exploit any emotion: fear, love, guilt, anxiety, and many others. And so that's the third way to get what you want: force, coercion, manipulation, and finally, rational persuasion. That's number 4. Rational persuasion is where you reason with someone. You may have something that I want, and I may not be able to pay you for it. I may sit down with you and try to persuade you to give it to me. Suppose you have an old guitar that I covet. You won't, well, I don't have any money to pay you for it, but I really want it. I might sit down with you and say, look, you don't play this guitar. I've watched you and I know you don't play it. It's just sitting in your attic. And when you die, it will go who knows where. Well, I love this guitar. It's a one of a kind. It's something I've wanted my whole life. I would take care of it. I would play it and love it and enjoy it. Would you please give it to me? Because I would derive more pleasure from it than you are. That might work. The person may say, you've persuaded me that the world will be a better place, all things considered, if I give you that guitar. And you seem like a nice person, so here you go. Here's the guitar. Now that's a form of rational persuasion. I got the guitar I wanted, but I didn't use any physical force. I didn't make any threats, so it wasn't coercive. I didn't manipulate the person, and I got the guitar. So I persuaded you to give it to me. That could happen as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. Hospers opposes force and coercion. He endorses or allows rational persuasion. He doesn't say much about manipulation. I think he would say manipulation is okay morally. If you want to exploit people's feelings, give it a try. I don't know what his view of manipulation is. He just doesn't say anything about it. But it's very clear in this essay that he, as a libertarian, is opposed to any use of physical force, any kind of threat of force. He's also clear that rational persuasion is always acceptable. Okay? Because if someone is persuaded by your reasoning, that person is acting voluntarily. And I just don't see what he says about manipulation. I put it in because it's a possible way to get things, but he doesn't say anything about it, at least as I could see. All right, so let's move on. Where do these rights that we have come from? Hospers is very clear. They do not come from government. The rights to life, liberty, and property are not creations of any government. In fact, Hospers seems to say that the function of government is to protect our rights. The rights that we have by nature must be protected by government. So government has to enact laws to protect everyone's right to life, everyone's right to liberty, and everyone's right to property. In fact, that's similar to the Declaration of Independence, isn't it? Let's go back and listen to this again. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, by God presumably, that they're endowed by their Creator, again, God, with certain unalienable rights. Now that word unalienable means rights that you can't get rid of. They're stuck to you. Right? No one can take them away from you. You can't sell them or barter them away. They're your rights, and they'll always be your rights. They can't be taken away from you. Notice, where do these rights come from according to the Declaration? From the Creator. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Hospers agrees that the rights we have, life, liberty, and property, are natural rights. That means they're not civil rights. They're rights that don't come to us from government. In fact, the rights that we have are often wielded against government. Hosper says that government is the most dangerous institution ever created by humanity. And our right to life is often used against the very government that claims that is trying to kill us or harm us or risk our lives in some way. So we have rights against the government. The government may not do certain things because of the rights of the citizens, the individual rights of the citizens. So it's very important that you remember this. The rights that we have, according to Hospers, are natural rights, not civil rights. And by civil rights, I mean rights created by government. They're not created by government. In fact, we wield them against government. It's government that's threatening our lives and liberty and property on a regular daily basis. So we need to be vigilant. We need to protect our rights from government. And government, when it's functioning properly, exists to protect our rights. The problem is it doesn't always protect them. Sometimes it threatens them. So, in practice, government is a threat to our rights. In theory, government exists solely to protect our rights. So there's a divergence between theory and practice, and that's common in many areas of life. In theory, government would serve only to protect our rights. In practice, government sometimes goes too far and becomes a threat to our rights. They tax us and take our property. They conscript us into a war that we oppose. And that threatens our lives. That puts our lives at risk. They restrict our liberty from time to time. In fact, conscription constricts your liberty as well as threatens your life. It does both of those things. It's interesting that in 1972, one of the main issues in the presidential campaign was the Vietnam War, the war in Vietnam. George McGovern was a peace president. He ran against the war, and he said that the war was Nixon's doing. Nixon had been president for 4 years already, and he was conducting the war. And so McGovern tried to make Nixon out as the warmonger, and he said, "I will end the war if you elect me." So when Hospers ran for president, war and the draft were major issues. And you can see that as a libertarian, he would have been opposed to the Vietnam War since it was not a defensive war. It was not meant to protect us. We weren't being invaded by the Vietnamese. We went over to their land to fight a war against them. Excuse me. So rights are not created by government. We need rights in large part to protect us from government, even though ideally government is supposed to be protecting our rights for us. What about the right to free speech? That's an aspect of liberty. The right to liberty includes the right to speak, right? The freedom to speak. And Hospers is somewhat of an absolutist about this. Not quite an absolutist, because he says that you have no right to speak in certain circumstances. You can't go onto someone else's property and speak and then claim when you're removed that your right to speak is being violated. You have to find a place on your own property or on public property where you're allowed to speak. So Hosper says that you have a right to speak, but it's negative only. Other people cannot prevent you from speaking as long as you're doing it on your own property. But of course, you can't go into someone else's house or onto someone else's business premises and speak and claim that you have a right to be there. You don't have a right to be there. Other people's right to property takes precedence. Right? I'm in my house right now. What if someone managed to get in? Maybe the door was left open. Someone got in here and started speaking on some topic, and it doesn't matter what the topic is. If I ejected that person from my house or called the police to do that, the person might say, "Wait, I have a right to speak." And I would say, "Not in my house, you don't. Right? This is my property. I have a right to my property. I have a right to expel people whom I don't want on my property, and I'm now expelling you. I don't want you here. Leave. If you don't leave, I'll call the police, and they will make you leave." So there are clashes between rights. In this case, a right to speak and a right to property. And when that occurs, Hosper seems to say that the right to property prevails. So the right to speak has limits, and those limits are drawn by other rights, such as the right to property. And you can't do things like yell fire in a crowded theater. That's a famous legal example. And what it means is falsely yell fire, right, as a prank. If you stood up in a theater, a crowded theater, knowing that there was no fire and yelled fire, there would be a tremendous rush, almost certainly, for the doors, and many people would be injured, maybe even killed, as everyone tries to get out at the same time. People may be trampled. So your right to speak does not include the right to falsely yell fire in a crowded theater. And Hospers recognizes that, because now you're endangering others with your speech. So libertarians are not absolutists about speech, but they're close. I mean, they believe in a robust right to speak. And Hospers himself says this, that in a university of all places, whether it's public or private, people should be free to express even offensive views, even unpopular, even very unpopular views. And the whole idea of a university is to bring people together and expose them to a wide range of views on various topics, and let them reason together. Let them make an argument in favor of something or against something, and let other people find fault with that argument. Okay, so a university of all places is a forum for free and robust speech, open and robust. What would Hosper say about communal property? You've probably heard the term commune. There have been various communes throughout human history, which is a group of people of whatever size who find a plot of land, a piece of land, and they go live there. They create a community, and they may implement certain rules that govern the behavior of the people who are members of that community. And one of their rules may be to have communally owned property, so that no individual owns anything in that community. Is Hospers opposed to that, a kind of collective property rather than individual property? He's not opposed to it, but he insists on two things. He insists that you be able to leave that commune at any point if you're unhappy with it. You can't be trapped there. There has to be an escape valve for you. If you want to go in voluntarily to that community and become a member and give up your private property or other rights, you may do so, okay? Because it's a voluntary exchange or transaction. But by the same token, once you're in, you have to be able to leave. You may find once you're in there that they're trying to brainwash you. You may find that certain people are being freeloaders. You're working hard every day for the sake of the group. Other people are lazy, and they're exploiting other people's hard work. And you may decide, I'm not going to participate in this any longer. It's not fair. And you may decide, I'm leaving. If they tried to stop you, that would be infringing on your right to liberty. If they tried to keep you in there, right? I'm talking about communes or communities. Some people, you could think of a cult as a kind of commune. And one of the things about cults is they typically try to brainwash their members so they won't want to leave, or so that they believe that they have no way of getting out. And Hospers, of course, would be opposed to that. Right? The group itself should not take steps to manipulate you in order to keep you there. It should always be a live option for you to get up and leave one day. So everything must be voluntary to a libertarian. No coercion, no force. Hospers gives an example of island castaways on pages 10 and 11. It involves two men, I think they're both men in his example, two men who divide up an island, and over a period of time, one of them is industrious and produces a garden and a source of clean water, and maybe some dwellings and various other things, stores up food and so on. The other man is lazy and does very little to develop his side of the island. Now suppose the winter comes on, and the man who had done nothing and accumulated no food is starving, cold, because he didn't build a shelter and collect fuel. He goes over to the productive man and says, can I have some food and shelter against the cold? The man who's being asked this may very well show concern and share, but he doesn't have to. He's entitled to say, no, you made your choice, you have to live with it. Or you made your bed, now sleep in it. Right? That might be harsh. Maybe the industrious man will help him initially, but let him know very clearly, I'm not going to help you again. So next, as soon as winter's over, you would best be putting in a crop and building a shelter and getting ready for the next winter, because I will not be helping you then. Right? So maybe you'll help for a while and then stop. Or you could be mean and say, I'm not helping you at all. Or you could be generous and say, okay, that's fine. I've got more than I need, and I'll be happy to help you whenever you ask for it. That would be a really generous person. But you have no duty to help that other, I think Hospers would say. And that other has no right against you. Because remember, there are no positive rights, according to Hospers. The rights are all negative. Rights to be left alone, not to have what you need to survive or flourish. Okay, let's turn to the second half of the essay on government. We've alluded to some of the things already, like the proper function of government. On page 13, Hospers says, the function of government is, quote, the protection of human rights, the protection of the rights that we have. Right? That's the proper function of government. And once again, these rights are threefold: life, liberty, and property. So let's look at some of the ways government, an ideal government, would protect our right to life, our negative right to life. Government protects our right to life by enacting laws against homicide, including murder. It enacts laws against attempted murder. So not only may you not murder someone, you may not even attempt to murder. So that's a violation of your right to life as well. There must be laws against maiming people, beating people, battering people, and all kinds of physical violence. All of that would be a way for the government to protect your right to life and bodily integrity. Okay? Also, government has a responsibility to enable wrongful death actions. Remember we talked earlier about civil suits? If somebody harms you, not only may you call the police to prosecute that person and punish that person, but if you've suffered a loss through that other person's wrongful actions, you can sue that person and recover damages that will make you whole again, to put you back in what's called the status quo ante, the situation you were in before the harm occurred. Okay, so it's a legitimate function of government to create a court system and a set of rules that allow individuals to sue others who have wronged them. That's called a tort system, T-O-R-T, tort law. Think of it as personal injury law. And that's a legitimate function of government. No libertarian opposes having a tort system. It's parallel to the criminal justice system. Okay? Crime is about punishing people for their wrongdoing. Tort law is about making people whole again when they have been wronged by other citizens. All right, so both of those are legitimate. Let's talk a little bit about the right to liberty, which includes the right to speak, the freedom to speak. That's an aspect of freedom. Okay? Freedom is a general idea. Freedom to speak is a particular idea within that general class. So Hosper says that there must be no censorship of ideas or books or films or anything else by the government. So libertarians are opposed to censorship, which is preventing people from speaking in advance before they speak. And so government can't require that movies be submitted to the government before they're released to the public, and then the government has people look them over to see whether they can be released. That's censorship. That's not acceptable. And what would also be unacceptable is punishing people after they speak. So suppose you produce a film that's offensive to people. Government can't punish you for that. That would be illegitimate. That's not within the proper scope of government. Right? Government is to protect us from being harmed. It's not to protect us from being offended or having our moral sensibilities outraged. Right? Living in society requires a certain thickness of skin. So if you have thin skin, if you're easily offended, then you better take steps to thicken it, because you have no right that other people avoid offending you or disgusting you or angering you. Okay, so speech is meant to be robust, not absolute. We talked about that earlier, but there's a robust right to speak. And finally, with respect to property, Hospers says that government will pass laws that prevent confiscation of people's property. It will pass laws that prohibit nationalizing industries, taking them over. For example, in certain South American countries, in the past few decades, the oil industry has been nationalized. It was owned by private citizens, and the government said, from today forward, it's not yours anymore. We own it. The government owns it. That's called nationalizing an industry. And of course, libertarians are opposed to that. That's not a legitimate function of government. Government should have, there should be laws against eminent domain. The government has no right to take people's private property to build highways and bridges and ballparks and things like that. Hospers would have opposed the building of the ballpark in Arlington in 1994, right? Because for two reasons. First of all, government money was used to, in part, to build it. It was tax money. People who don't care one bit about baseball had to pay a tax on their purchases to subsidize the ballpark, the construction and maintenance of the ballpark. Now, to a libertarian, that's outrageous, right? If someone wants to build a ballpark, he or she should do it with his or her own money. You have no right to use tax money. The government is powerful, and you have no right to get the government to tax other people to help pay for your ballpark. Okay? You should build it yourself and charge people enough for admission to pay for it and maybe make you a profit as well. The second reason Hospers would have opposed the building of the ballpark in Arlington in 1994 is that it required the destruction of many neighborhoods under what's called the eminent domain power of government. Government is allowed to take private property for public purposes. That's allowed by the Constitution, provided it pays fair market value to the owners. But there were people who didn't want to sell their homes, people who had lived there their whole life, who had a sentimental attachment to the neighborhood, the streets, the parks, and so on, and they were made to sell their property. And even if they held out, the property would have been bulldozed at some point and they would have been physically removed. Yes, they would have been compensated, fair market value, but they had no choice. The government got to make the decision. And it did. It destroyed whole neighborhoods in order to build the original ballpark. So Hospers would be against that. That's called the power of eminent domain. He would support laws that prohibit and punish robbery, trespass, fraud, misrepresentation, and so on. Government should have a law of patent and copyright. The purpose of copyright is to give people an incentive to create valuable works, books, for example. And what the government does is it gives you an exclusive right to the property you create. It's called a copyright for a period of years. And you get to make all the profits you can during that time period. And there's typically under the law, there's a period of renewal. So if the copyright is for 27 years after you create the object, when the 27 years is up, you can apply for a renewal for another 27 years. But eventually, the property that you created will go to the government. I'm sorry, it won't go to the government. The property will be open to all to use in whatever way they choose. So copyright law is designed to strike a balance between motivating people to produce art and other intellectual property, and also to let the public benefit it at some point, 50 or 100 years from now. So if I want to make some use of David Hume's famous Treatise of Human Nature, which came out several hundred years ago, 1739, 1740, came out in 2 parts, I can do anything I want. David Hume is long dead. There's no copyright in his works, in any of his works. So I can republish David Hume's books. I can add value to them if I want. I can hire an editor who's an expert on David Hume to write a long introduction. So when you buy a book, of David Hume's treatise, it typically has a title page, table of contents, and then an introduction by the editor, who's an expert on Hume, and then Hume's actual words. And that may be followed by some appendices that are of value, a glossary, an index, a bibliography, and so on. So notice what I've done. I've taken Hume's work, which is in the public domain, and I've added some value to it. I am now allowed to copyright the stuff that I added: the introduction, the table of contents, the bibliography, any appendices that I supplied, the index, and so on. That's my property that I created. But Hume's words, that's not my property. Anybody can do anything with that. Okay, I've gone on too long about copyright. It's an interesting aspect of the law. And Hospers appears not to have any problem with that. Okay, because the individual who created it does have the exclusive right to it for a period of time. And at a certain point, it's going to go into the public domain. Hosper seems okay with that. There should also be laws against libel and slander, which are the 2 forms of defamation. Defamation is designed to protect people's reputations from harm. So you have no right to say false things that disparage people or damage their reputations. And if you do, you can be sued for damages for it. Okay, and Hospers would support that. There should be laws that allow people to sue for defamation. Think of your reputation as a form of property. Each of us has a strong property interest in our reputations. And when other people are sullying our reputations by saying false and disparaging things about us, we have every right to protect our property by suing them. And that will not only deter them and others from doing it again, but it will compensate us for the damage it has done to our reputations. So on page 11, Hospers writes, the role of government should be limited to the retaliatory use of force against those who have initiated its use. It should not enter into any other areas such as religion, social organization, and economics. So the role of government is very constricted. I hope you can see that. The role of government is to protect us from each other by having criminal laws and tort laws. And the role of government is to protect all of us collectively from external threats. So we need a police force. We need courts to adjudicate conflicts between individuals and to prosecute suspected criminals. We need a military that is adequate to protect us from conquest or attempts to conquer us. All of that's going to cost money, right? And that money, government makes no money. It takes money from the citizenry through taxation and fees. So libertarians, unlike anarchists, believe that some amount of taxation by government is legitimate, but only enough taxation to fund the legitimate purposes of government, which is protecting us from each other and protecting us from external enemies. Notice, Hospers would be opposed to any kind of war or military conflict other than purely defensive uses. So we should not have been in Vietnam, right? Hospers would say. We have no right to police the world. Any United States troops that are posted or stationed around the world right now should be brought home immediately. That's the libertarian position. What we need to do is protect our borders. We need to have an adequate military, including missiles and other high-tech stuff. And if we're ever attacked, we need to have a way to repel the attack, to keep the invaders out. But we have no right to go around the world policing other countries. We should warn them, let them know we are heavily armed and we are able and willing to protect ourselves. So you better be on guard. You better not attack us. Right? That will be a deterrent, right? Being heavily armed. But we shouldn't be so heavily armed that we overdo it, because that's just taxing citizens to no purpose. So we need enough taxation to support enough of a military to deter aggressive foreign countries. And beyond that, we shouldn't just stockpile weapons for the sake of stockpiling them. I mean, we have to make a judgment. How much is enough? Right? So at some point, we need to say, do we now have enough to repel the most likely threats? And if the answer is yes, then we need to stop stockpiling weaponry. On page 12, Hospers writes, government is the most dangerous institution known to man. He says it's far more dangerous than individuals or individual criminals because it claims and has a monopoly of force. Government has armies at its disposal. It has police forces and investigators at its disposal. And here's the interesting thing about humanity. We're not angels. We may not be devils, but we're not angels either. And there's a human propensity to take whatever power one has and misuse it. In fact, there's an old saying, it comes from Lord Acton. I call it Lord Acton's dictum. Maybe you've heard it. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The idea is that humans can't be trusted with too much power, because whenever someone has power, there's always a strong temptation to abuse it, to use it for improper purposes. Okay, maybe you can think of some examples of that in recent years. Okay, I won't mention any. I think I could name many, right, where government agents, government agencies have abused the power that we have given them and violated people's rights. That's what Hospers is worried about, he and other libertarians. Government has power. That doesn't make every use of that power right. So we've got to monitor and watch government to keep their uses of power within proper bounds. Right? Hospers and other libertarians look at government very warily, don't they? They look at government as the enemy, and they need to be kept under control, strict control. Otherwise, government will run wild and trample on our rights and our interests. Now, I think things have changed a lot since 1972. I was 15 years old that year, and I remember the campaign. I had on my wall in my bedroom, I had a bumper sticker. I won't tell you which side I supported. I could tell you, it's no big deal, but I was involved in the campaign. I paid attention to it. And I can tell you that the general atmosphere in the country at that time was people were wary of government. People saw government as a force for evil. Government was drafting young men and sending them to a part of the world they didn't know anything about, to fight and possibly die, and many did die. Taxes were raised to pay for the war effort. And people looked at government as the enemy. Many people, not everybody, of course. I think today things are very different. I think many people look at government as a benevolent force in their lives. They look to government to give them things and do things for them. They think they give the government the benefit of the doubt. They're not wary of government as lots of people were back in the early 70s. So things have changed a lot. I don't quite know why. I'm sure there's an explanation, but I haven't come to figure it out. All right, now Hospers has a lot more in this article. Let me just mention one more topic. I promise about 5 more minutes. There are 3 types of law, according to Hospers, and only one of them is legitimate. The other 2 are illegitimate. Now here they are. Number 1, there are laws that protect, quote, individuals against themselves, such as laws against fornication and other sexual behavior, alcohol, and drugs. All right, unquote. That's page 17. So some of the laws that government passes appear to be designed to protect us from our own folly, from our own stupidity, our own rashness. That, according to Hospers and other libertarians, is unacceptable. Right? I'm an adult. I'm not a child. Don't you dare, government, don't you dare treat me as though I were a child. I'm not. I may make foolish decisions, but I have every right to make those decisions and to suffer the consequences. It's not your role. You're not my dad. You're not my mom. So stop it. Right? Those laws are illegitimate. If I want to use a recreational drug and I'm not harming anyone else by doing so, it's none of government's business. And yet many drugs which are used for recreational purposes are today prohibited and punished. Just the use or possession is punished. Now, things are changing, as you know. Marijuana for recreational purposes is now legal or decriminalized in many states, and the number of states is growing. Maybe Texas will soon decriminalize the recreational use and possession of marijuana. I don't think, unless I missed something, I don't think the state of Texas has done that. But I wouldn't be a bit surprised if soon that's not the case. Right? Texas has a kind of individualistic streak compared to other states. It's not a progressive state like Wisconsin or Oregon, but there's kind of a frontier spirit here, kind of, I don't know, an individualism in Texas. It goes way back in history, a wariness of government, big government. And I can imagine the state of Texas decriminalizing marijuana for recreational uses in the next decade, perhaps, if not sooner. So, libertarians are opposed to any laws, the purpose of which is to protect us from ourselves. Okay, laws like that are called legal paternalism. Pater is father, so paternalism means treating someone as though that were your child. Legal paternalism is where the government treats its citizens, adult citizens, as though they were children who are incapable of making their own decisions. Okay, second type of law. These are laws that protect, quote, individuals against aggressions by other individuals, such as laws against murder, robbery, and fraud, unquote. That sort of law is justified, according to Hospers and his libertarian friends. Okay? That's a perfectly legitimate function of government, passing laws that protect us from each other. Not from ourselves, but from each other. And finally, there are laws that require, quote, people to help one another. For example, all laws which rob Peter to pay Paul, such as welfare, unquote. So Hospers and libertarians generally are opposed to welfare programs. Because think about it, a welfare program is where the government agents tax the citizenry, take money from them without their permission, and then once they get the money, they decide where to spend it. And one of the ways they spend it is by giving it to people who are judged to be in need. Right? They get welfare, food stamps, for example, or housing vouchers to get cheap or free housing. Okay, think of those as welfare programs. They're well-intentioned. Hospers would admit that. They're well-intentioned, but they have a lot of bad consequences, and they violate people's rights, right? Government has no right to take my money and give it to other people, they say. Okay? That's what's happening with taxation. You're taking my money without my consent, and then you are using it to try to help other people. So not only are these laws, as well-meaning as they may be, not only are they counterproductive in many cases because they create dependency. People who receive government benefits lose the incentive to work and to provide for themselves and their families and to build a career, get an education, save money, and things like that. And you get a cycle of dependency. Now I'm speaking as though I were a libertarian. You get a cycle of dependency, and that's certainly not in anyone's interest, right? We want to give people an incentive to work, not to avoid work. So Hospers says those kinds of laws are unacceptable. So of the 3 types of laws, 2 of them are ruled out by libertarians. Only that second type of law is legitimate. Here's what he says on page 18. Laws should be limited to the second class only, aggression by individuals against other individuals. All right? Now there's a discussion near the end of the essay about getting stuff for free. How many times have you heard someone say, I want a free education? There's no such thing as a free education. You may not be paying for the education you're getting, but someone is, and typically it's someone you don't even know, and someone who doesn't even know who you are. Why should someone else have to work and pay for you to get an education? Hospers asks. You have no right that other people work to give you stuff. There's no such thing as a free lunch. There's actually an acronym for this. It's called TANSTAFL, right? It's a term you learn in economics. TANSTAFL, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Things may look free, but as my mother used to say, money doesn't grow on trees. Government doesn't make any money. It collects money through coercion and then spends it in various ways. It takes money from Peter, it robs Peter, and it pays Paul. And to make it even worse, government siphons off a big chunk of it for its own administrative expenses. So we all lose through this government intervention in the economy. Libertarians say, and here's Hospers speaking, page 20, the free market is the best solution to all problems relating to the material aspect of man's life, unquote. So libertarians believe in freedom for individuals. They want there to be free and open markets that people can exchange goods and services voluntarily with whomever wishes to purchase them. And the thought is that in a free market with very little government intervention, we will all prosper. We will all be better off than if we had an active interventionist government who's trying to distribute goods and services to where government agents think they should be. So libertarians are committed to the market, a free market, and they believe that that's the recipe for prosperity. Okay, now I said a lot. I wasn't even sure I'd cover everything I wanted to. I thought I might have to spend part of the next lecture on it, but I think I'm done. We're an hour and 13 minutes into it today. Let's get a fresh start on Jan Narvison's essay when I see you again, probably on Wednesday next week. Read at least half of Narvison's essay for Wednesday. And the title of his article is The Medical Minimum, (0). There's no minimum of medicine or health care to which people are entitled. You're not entitled to any amount of health care. It's your responsibility to provide for your own health and that of your dependents. Don't look to other people to provide, or to government, to provide you with something that's your responsibility to provide. Okay, have a great day and a nice weekend. I'll see you twice next week. Both days will be devoted to Narvison.